introduce the speaker to us. Welcome to the session, Alex. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Purva, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you.
Okay, so Jai Bhim and Namo Buddhaya. So I would like to introduce Dr. Aleix here to our forum here. So Dr. Aleix was born in Barcelona in Spain, 1982. He has a BA Classics degree from Barcelona. He has done his MA in Sanskrit from Pune University in India. He has a PhD in Indian Studies from the Cambridge University, United Kingdom. His specialization is Pali grammatical traditions and Pali scholastic traditions. Currently, he is the head of the Department of Pali and Languages at the Shan State Buddhist University in Myanmar. And he is also a postdoctoral fellow, a Khyentse postdoctoral fellow in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He also teaches Pali online at yogicstudies.com. So Dr. Aleix, a warm welcome to you to our forum, and we are looking forward on this unique choice of topic that you have chosen for today's lecture. So we are waiting with bated breath. Please welcome to the forum.
Thank you so very much, Purva, to you and to the Ambedkar Association of North America. Welcome, everyone. Actually, when I entered the room a few minutes before it was my turn, I was surprised to see that in the crowd, although I cannot see the faces, I could hear the voices. I think there are many young kids among us, so that's actually very good. At least it's quite relevant to our talk today. I don't know how many of you are under 8, but as you will see in the presentation that I'm going to give, this is very much about the two parallel lives. When we say two parallel lives, means two parallel biographies. We are not 100% sure about the lives of people who lived 2,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago, such as the persons that we are going to talk about, namely Moggaliputta Tissa Thera and Bhikkhu Nāgasena. But we do have biographies. Biographies are texts. These are found in books, and these books are written in Pali. I hope mostly everyone knows what the Pali language is. Actually, before we just started, I heard some of you reciting the 5 precepts in Pali. So I understand that whether you call it Pali or Magadhi or some other name, you actually know which language that is. So in the Pali literature, we find a lot of texts, very different types of texts, as you can imagine. Some of them, again, as what we were listening to before, I think the name of the person who was reading, the boy who was reading, was Sparsh. There was a story. So we find lots of stories in the Pali Tipitaka, in the canon, and also in the commentaries, in the sub-commentaries, and we also find many collections of stories that are in Pali. So what I'm going to talk about today is about 2 stories. And when we call it the parallel lives, it's because these 2 stories are about 2 lives, the life of Nagasena and the life of Moggaliputta. Now, why are these lives important? Well, they are important for many reasons, which we are going to see. But one important aspect of the talk that I'm going to give subsequently right now is the idea of the Abhidhamma. And that's something that is not in the title, but it's in the origin of this talk that I have already given in a very slightly different manner. But basically, that's not the first time that I talk about this subject. And initially, what interested me about the parallel lives of Moggaliputta Tissa and Bhikkhu Nāgasena is not only the fact that these are 2 parallel lives, that they are so similar, strikingly similar, but the fact that they represent what an Abhidharma scholar or what an Abhidhammika person is, that is an expert in the Abhidhamma. Again, I'm not so sure that everyone knows what the Abhidhamma is, but the Abhidhamma is that section of the teaching of the Buddha which deals with the ultimate truth. You know, that basically, just to simplify things, the Buddha was teaching at two different levels. He was teaching at the normal level, and when we discuss with people in the market or at school, they say, "What's your name?" My name is, let's say, my name is Aleix. So we believe that there is a person here that is called Aleix. But at the ultimate level of truth, so ultimately there is no essential soul here, or nothing essential in the person that I may call myself, my own self. There is nothing but the five khandhas, or the five aggregates. So if you look at the person as just an individual, Mr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so, you have the national identity card, all that kind of stuff, that is conventional truth. It is true, but that's conventional truth. But if you look at the ultimate truth, things that are more philosophical, if you wish, if you analyze the reality in a philosophical manner, then you will say that the person is the five aggregates. So that way of looking at things, that's the Abhidhamma way of understanding reality. And these two persons, Moggaliputta Tissa Thera and Bhikkhu Nāgasena, are very important, very, very important in the history of Buddhist Theravada Abhidhamma. In Sanskrit, it's called Abhidharma, so it's the Abhidhamma. And by looking at the stories of their lives, we can have a glimpse of what it meant, at least in the tradition, what it meant to be an Abhidhammika, or what were those things that were part of the image of the prototype of a master Abhidhammika. So let's begin. First of all, we need to talk about two texts. I don't know if you know them, but I'm going to briefly introduce them. The first one is called the Kathāvatthu. The Kathāvatthu, as the name indicates, is a selection of points for discussion. And that's one of the 7 books of the Abhidhamma collection in the Tipitaka. So the Tipitaka, as the name indicates, has 3 baskets, 3 Pitakas, Tipitakas. So one of the Pitakas is the Abhidhamma Pitaka. In the Abhidhamma Pitaka, there are 7 books, and one of them is the Kathāvatthu. And the Kathāvatthu is the only book in the Abhidhamma Pitaka that is not ascribed to the Buddha. So most of the Abhidhamma is basically the word of the Buddha. It's the Buddha Vachana. But the Kathāvatthu has an author that is not the Buddha and was not living at the time of the Buddha. So that's kind of special. It's kind of very special text. The Kathāvatthu actually represents a book or a compilation of philosophical discussions that was redacted or fixed at the time of King Asoka. So that's, again, quite interesting. This is what the tradition says, and it seems that it's quite true. Of course, according to tradition, Moggaliputta Tissa Thera was the author of the book, in the sense that Moggaliputta Tissa just expanded something that the Buddha had already taught. But basically, this is a book for which we have a specific author. Generally, that's not the case in the Tipitaka. The Tipitaka is basically the word of the Buddha. But in this case, the Kathāvatthu has an author, Moggaliputta Tissa. Now, this is something that we know because tradition says so, because we have learned that in the commentaries, in the tradition, in later traditions. If you would just read the Kathāvatthu in Pali, or even in translation, you will not find any information about Moggaliputta Tissa. There is nothing in the Kathāvatthu that tells us what the Kathāvatthu is, or what's the context, when was it written, what kind of work is it, what does it represent. However, in the Theravada tradition, the Kathāvatthu is directly connected to the Third Council. And the Third Council is one of the most important events in the history of Theravada Buddhism, if not the most important, because that's the moment at the time of Asoka where the Theriya community, the community of Theras, of those Buddhists who follow the tradition of the Theras, the Theravamsa, they met and they recited the text together. That was a Sangiti, what we call a concile was a Sangiti, chanting together. And they fixed what were the scriptures that were supposed to be the word of the Buddha. So the person who organized that event was none other than Moggaliputta Tissa Thera. So Moggaliputta Tissa is not just the author of the Kathāvatthu. In history, he is known as the organizer, the convenor, the chairman of the Third Buddhist Council. So whether that is historical or not, we don't know. If you remember in the Ashokan inscriptions, there is no mention to Moggaliputta Tissa Thera. There is no mention to the Third Council. There are certain mentions to the Buddha or to Buddhism, but we don't have any specifics. In the Theravada tradition, however, we do have many specifics, and it seems very clear within the Theravada tradition, within the Pali tradition, that Moggaliputta Tissa was the man of the moment, was the man who convened this meeting to purify the Sangha at the time of Ashoka. And he also produced one work, one philosophical treatise called the Kathāvatthu, which is about philosophical discussions. And the Kathāvatthu is also a very important testimony for the study of Indian philosophy, especially Buddhist philosophy, because we are now talking about the 3rd century before the Common Era, the time of Ashoka. And in the Kathāvatthu, what we find is discussions between Buddhists. So these are not discussions between Buddhists and Brahmins, but between some schools of Buddhism, like the Theras and other schools. Again, the names of the other schools are not mentioned in the Kathāvatthu. They are mentioned in the commentary. But from what we learn in the commentary and from what we can gather in the questions and answers or the debate of the Kathāvatthu, we can see that these are actually discussions among Buddhists. That means that this is a text that indicates that at the time of Ashoka, there were already certainly different lines of thought, different ideas within the Buddhist community. Some of these ideas later on developed in what we know today as the Mahayana. And some of these ideas developed into kind of iconic ideas or kind of hallmarks of certain schools of what is known as the Hinayana. For instance, there is one discussion on the existence of the dharmas, whether the dharmas exist in the past, present, and future, which is one of the central ideas of the Sarvastivada school, a very important school that has left very little documentation, but it's already there. So it's a phenomenal text. It's a very interesting text. It's very difficult to read. And one of the interesting things about this debate, is that they are the opposite of the Facebook or social network debates of today, where everyone wants to win. In the Kathāvatthu, in many cases, nobody wins. It's like one gives the one opinion in a way that it is understood that the other party will accept, using arguments or using references to the literature, so that the other party will accept that this is a valid reason. And again, the other party, whether it's some kind of proto-Mahayana or Sarvastivada or any other type of school of thought, they will also try to justify their own ideas on the basis of the literature that they share, that all the Buddhists share. So that's enough for now about the Kathāvatthu. This is one of the important books of the Abhidhamma, written by Moggaliputta Tissa, the great man of the moment in the Ashokan time, the convenor of the 3rd Council. And then we are going to talk about another book, that's the Milindapañha. And the Milindapañha is at the same time very similar to the Kathāvatthu and very different. It is very similar, as you will see, it's almost a parallel, because it's also about debates. The Milindapañha is not really part of the Tipitaka, although today it is included in the Khuddaka Nikaya, in one of the collections of the Sutta Pitaka. So it's not in the Abhidhamma, but if we would be strict in our categorization, we should include the Milindapañha in the Abhidhamma Pitaka. But somehow the Abhidhamma needed to have seven books. 7 is a kind of symbolic number. So at some point, I guess the tradition was fixed. So any other book that was kind of Abhidhammic in nature went to the Khuddaka Nikaya. The same can be said of the Patisambhidamagga that went to the Khuddaka Nikaya, although it's a kind of proto-Abhidhamma text. So this Milindapañha, as many of you may know, or some of you may not know, so Milinda is actually, it's a proper name here. It's the name of a king. And this king, apparently, it's historically someone called Menander. It's a Greek king or Indo-Greek king, a king from Bactria. The city in Pali is called Sagala. In today's Punjab, that would be, as we'll see in the map later. So it's a dialogue between this Greek king and Nagasena, Bhikkhu Nāgasena, which is one of our characters. And Bhikkhu Nāgasena is a Buddhist monk, actually a master. And this dialogue is similar to the Kathāvatthu because the whole point is trying to clarify doubts or contradictions, places or points in the doctrine, in the teachings of the Buddha, where it seems that there is something that is not totally clear, or there are points that are weak in the philosophy, and then scholars from other philosophical schools will criticize the Buddha's message because it hasn't been explained clearly enough. So on both cases, we find someone who is the Siddhantin or the one who is defending and explaining the teaching of the Buddha in order to clarify certain points that are sticky, that are not yet clear. The implication is that some of the teachings in the Tipitaka are too deep, are too subtle. And so we still needed to have Moggaliputta Tissa in the 3rd century BC, and then whether that's historical or not, but according to the legend or the tradition, there was this dialogue in the Indo-Greek kingdom of Bactria between Nagasena, Bhikkhu Nāgasena, and King Milinda. Of course, guess what? Bhikkhu Nāgasena convinced the Greek king, but this King Milinda is a kind of difficult partner for the debate. He asks very difficult questions, and he doesn't hesitate to say that he doesn't believe anything. For instance, he would represent more or less what today perhaps many Westerners say or would argue when they meet a Buddhist monk. For instance, especially some Westerners who are very much into this secular scientific discourse, materialistic discourse, not believing in rebirth or reincarnation, and so forth. So there are moments where King Milinda says, "I don't believe you Buddhists say that, but I don't believe it. Show me that that is correct." And then Nagasena will go on and say, in some other aspects, the Milindapañha and the Kathavatthu are not similar. They are not similar because the Kathavatthu is a text that is very difficult, and it's sometimes it's not very clear who is winning the debate or what the conclusion is in every debate. It's also a text that doesn't tell us anything about itself. But the Milindapañha is the opposite, because the first chapter of the Milindapañha is a kind of background story that tells us how this dialogue between Bhikkhu Nāgasena and the king Milinda or King Menander, how did it come to be? What happened in previous lives and also in that life, so that these two persons met and they had this dialogue. So there is the story of the life of Nagasena that is found in the Milindapañha itself. So you can see here the Kathavatthu is 3rd century before the Common Era. The Milindapañha is later than the Kathavatthu. But the story of the life of Nagasena is in this book. This book is 1st century before the Common Era. But the story of the life of Moggaliputta Tissa Thera is not in the Kathavatthu. We have to jump to the 5th century of the Common Era in order to know about his life. And the literary life, the biography of Moggaliputta Tissa is found in the Vinaya Attakatha, that means in the commentary on the Vinaya Pitaka. It's not in the commentary on the Kathavatthu, although there are references there, certainly. But this kind of full biography of Moggaliputta Tissa is found in the Vinaya commentary. And if you are wondering why, the reason is it has to do with what I've said at the beginning, namely that Moggaliputta Tissa is not just important in the history of Abhidhamma. He is very important in the history of Theravada as a whole, because he was the responsible for the organization of the Third Council. So when the narrative of the Third Councils is related in the Vinaya Atthakatha, in the introduction, then there is a moment where there is a transition from the Second Council to the Third Council. And here we find the life of Moggaliputta Tissa Thera, right? So far, I hope we are all following. I said a lot in just 3 slides. There are more. I think I have about an hour or so I'll try not to talk too much, but I have to fill up this an hour. If no one complains, I hope everything is fine so far. So here's the thing. The Kathāvatthu is older than the Milindapañha. The Milindapañha means the dialogue between Nagasena and Milinda. But the text with the life of Nagasena is earlier than the text with the life of Moggaliputta Tissa. Here, it seems that if they are so similar, if these 2 lives are so similar, as we are going to see, it could be that whoever was writing the life of Moggaliputta Tissa Thera was perhaps using the life of Nagasena as a model. And this is what I propose. It's one of the possibilities here. The authors or the compilers of the Vinaya Atthakatha, they could have seen in the person of Nagasena, as he is presented in the Milindapañha, as a kind of model for the prototypical, for the ideal Abhidhammika. And then when the life of Moggaliputta Tissa had to be written, it is possible that the same model was used. Now here, I guess I have to stop for a second, at least, because I understand that according to the tradition, these materials are not made up. So we cannot just say that the authors of the Vinaya Atthakatha decided to make up a biography of someone as important as Moggaliputta Tissa Thera, which is more or less what I was saying, right? So what I was suggesting is that no one really knew about the life of Moggaliputta Tissa, the historical life of this person. It's just that at some point, when the history of the councils, the Third Councils after the Buddha's parinirvana, when that history had to be written, and again, it's not a history in the modern sense of the term, it's a kind of story or history. When that story had to be written, and we had to have a chapter on the life of Moggaliputta Tissa. So what I was suggesting is that there was no information, but still somehow we needed to present that person in a way that would be convincing as the person that he was supposed to be, like the convenor of the Third Council, author of the Kathāvatthu. So what I'm saying is that perhaps the text with the life of Nagasena was used in a kind of creative way. And then I was saying also that some people will object and they will say, it is not that the commentaries were making up the lives of the ancient teachers. They were probably based on ancient biographies that maybe they were communicated or transmitted orally for many centuries or many decades or in a written way, but they were not just making things up. So I guess I will have to explain why I think that either the life of Nagasena or the life of Moggaliputta Tissa Thera is a model for the other, or they are both taking the same model. Yeah. So my argument is that the way they are explained, the way these stories are told, is so similar. In some cases, it's actually identical. Now it seems that somehow one is using the materials of the other, and I don't think that it would be a problem to suppose that the life of Moggaliputta Tissa in the Atthakatha was based on the life of Nagasena, because I think that these texts, they don't need to be read as historical documents only. Of course, they are historical documents, but they are more than that. And these stories, sometimes they have the goal of teaching something to the audience, rather than telling us whether something really happened or not at a particular point of time. So the fact that I would suggest that the life of Tissa in the commentaries is it's a kind of creation, that doesn't mean that it's false or that it's useless or that it's a kind of forgery or that it's not historical. But I think it carries certain values that are important in the tradition, and that certainly are related to this ideal of the third council. Great. So a few points just to begin. The Kathavatthu is problematically included in the Theravada Abhidhamma because it's the work of a disciple that is much later than the Buddha, not the Buddha. The Kathavatthu does not explain what it is. A tradition relates the Kathavatthu with the third council. There is a discrepancy between what we find in the Kathavatthu and what the tradition says that the Kathavatthu represents. So the Kathavatthu doesn't seem to be actually a kind of the minute or a transcription of the third council. It doesn't seem like that. It's in something different. And finally, the narrative of the life of Moggaliputta Tissa is mirrored in the life of Nagasena, as it is found in the Pali Milindapañha. Now, let's start with the parallelisms. The first parallelism is that we find in the life of Tissa. I'll just call this Venerable Thera, I will call him Tissa, because it's shorter. There is a prophecy that 218 years after, this is the Buddha speaking, right? After my parinibbana, a bhikkhu called Moggaliputta Tissa Thera, seated amidst 1,000 bhikkhus, will compile 500 suttas of his own doctrine and 500 of the others' doctrines, altogether 1,000 suttas, and will compose the Kathavatthu manual, the Prakarana, the Kathavatthu Prakarana, of the same size as the Digha Nikaya. So here the Buddha is actually giving the prophecy and also giving a date. This date, I don't know if you are aware of that, but it's very important in our chronology of the parinibbana, because we can calculate approximately the time of the third council, the time of Moggaliputta Tissa, the time of Asoka. So 218 years before that, that would have been the parinibbana of the Buddha. In another tradition, it's 100 years difference, not 218. But this number 218 that you may have seen in several places, it's found here. And it has to do with our friend, the Thera Moggaliputta Tissa Thera. Right. So there is also another similar prophecy about the Milinda and Nagasena. So in the story of the Milindapañha, both Milinda and Nagasena, in a previous life, they were monks. And they had a kind of argument. One of them was a samanera, a novice, and the other one was the head monk of the monastery. They had an argument, and they both made the aspiration to become great scholars of the Buddha's teaching. So they both went through the cycle of existences among gods and humans, spending an entire Buddha era, the Kalpa. Then in the same way that Moggaliputta Tissa Thera was seen by our Bhagavad, similarly, so here it's the tradition itself is telling us that these two persons, or actually here we should include King Milinda, but these two books, the Kathavatthu and the Milinda, are kind of parallels, are similar moments in the history of Buddhism. So in the same way that Moggaliputta Tissa Thera was seen by our Bhagavad, similarly, they, that is Nagasena and Milinda, they were seen. And the Buddha said, 500 years after my parinibbana, Milinda and Nagasena will be born. And the Dhamma that I have taught in a subtle way, they will analyze it by making it, sorry about the typo, making it smooth and clear through questions, similes, and logical reasonings. Thus, they were predicted. So the Buddha formulated the prediction. So according to the Theravada literature, Moggaliputta Tissa and Nagasena had parallel lives. They were both predestined. So the Buddha had already seen them coming in the future to save Buddhism at different points of time. And as you will see, they both grew up as prodigies. They were prodigy children, prodigy kids. That's why I was so happy to see so many kids in the audience. I don't know if you kids are still there or this is being too boring, but this is about kids, actually. It's about two children because they already stood out at a very early age. It's not just early age. I mean, this thing is very serious. It's like even before they were born, they were already sought after by the Theras of their moment. So this kind of practice that we see still today, sometimes in Tibetan Buddhism, of which I'm not an expert, so forgive me if I miss some technical aspects, but sometimes there's a prediction that maybe a teacher will be reborn in somewhere in some area, and then some monks are sent there to see if they can find who is the child, who is actually the reincarnation of is a tulku or something like that. So this practice that maybe some Theravadins could say that this is this kind of Mahayana stuff or Tantra or Tibetan stuff, and it's all made up. We already find it not only in the Milindapañha, but also in the life of Moggaliputta Tissa. It's because the thing is that sometimes the Sangha will go to a particular heaven and request some deity, some god, to be born in the world, so that this god will become a great, a very intelligent person who will be able to debate with the enemies of Buddhism, or the rivals, let's say, because generally Buddhism has no enemies. Let's say rivals and not enemies. So then the narratives, being close to identical in many passages, suggest that one of them was the model of the other. I'm repeating same thing here because that's one of the main points that I want to make. And in terms of the events described, Tissa is older. So in history, Tissa comes first. But the text that tells us the life of Tissa seems to postdate the biography of Nagasena, and it is therefore possible that Nagasena's biography was taken as a model for Tissa's life. So this is a possibility. It's not sure at all because some parts of the Milindapañha are also late. So it is possible that one is the model for the other, or that they both have a common model, a kind of archetypal life of a prodigy kid that we find in other places. But in the Pali tradition, the text that we have offer this kind of image, that the text where we find the life of Tissa is actually later than the text where we find the life of Nagasena. And one wonders, like, would it be possible that Nagasena's life being so interesting would have been used as the model for Tissa? So in both, here we can see a few parallels, and then I will show you some details. But these are events that are similar in both biographies. In the case of the life of Nagasena, it kind of, the whole thing starts before even they were born. In a previous era, so in the case of Nagasena, at the time of the Buddha Kashyapa, that is before our Buddha Gautama, so many thousands of years ago or millions of years ago, there was another Buddha called Kassapa. So at that time, there was this episode, this incident between an abbot and a novice. And that's where the future Nagasena makes the aspiration to become a great master of Buddhist philosophy or the Buddhist doctrine. And similarly, in the case of Tissa, it is already during the second council in Vaishali, in Vesali, that the arahants of the second council, because they are arahants, right? They already see that there's going to be trouble in the future. So this is not the last council. And they see that they will need someone to be there and sort things out. So it's the arahants of the second council also, they will go to heaven and convince one of the Brahmas, as you see in the point number 3, in the third row. The arahant of the second council visit the Brahma world, is one of the heavens, the Brahma heaven, in order to persuade Brahma Tissa, so Tissa is the name of one of the Brahmas, to be born in the human world. And Tissa is easily persuaded. So finally, this God will say yes. This is like, for you to understand what that means, it's like, suppose you have a very nice job, or I don't know, I guess this is something like, I come from Barcelona, so if you know something about soccer or football, suppose you are playing, when Messi was playing, you're playing among the gods like Messi and that kind of level, and someone comes to you and says, please come to play for the kind of the third division tournament that no one cares about. So this is the human world compared to the God's world. So why would a Brahma be born in the human world? So the only way to convince this Brahma God is to say that if they come to the human world, they will be able to protect the Buddha's teaching. So this is a kind of reversal of the story of Brahma asking the Buddha to teach when the Buddha, after enlightenment, didn't want to teach. And remember that it was Sakka or Brahma who requested the Buddha to teach. So in this case, it's the opposite. It's some arahants that request some Brahma to protect what the Buddha had already taught. Then in the life of Nagasena, we find something similar. So at the time when Milinda is born, finally, at the moment of the story, it's a king that is challenging everyone, going around and harassing all the philosophers with difficult questions. So even the Buddhist community are very much afraid, and they all retreat, all the Buddhist monks, they retreat to the mountains, to the Himavanta, to the Himalaya. And there they have to decide what to do. And they say, well, there's no one among us who is able to discuss with this king, King Milinda. So let's send a kind of delegation. Let's take a flight, right? But they can fly, so let's take a flight. Let's go to the Tavatimsa heaven, the heaven of the 33 gods, and persuade that god called Mahasena. See that Mahasena is also similar to Nagasena, a similar name. So this Brahma Mahasena, who is a Devaputta, is also finally convinced. Although at the beginning he doesn't want to be born as a human, finally they say, well, if you are born as a human, we offer you the very attractive possibility to actually defend the Buddha's teaching. So it is actually kind of clearing and purifying the teaching of the Buddha. And then he said, oh, in that case, then I accept. So if you want to have a kind of idea of what we are talking about in terms of geographical coordinates or terms, so here up there is Sakala, that's the town of King Milinda. It's not far from Takshila or Takshashila. And the map here is India at the time of the Mauryan Empire, the Ashokan Empire. And here's Pataliputra, which is today Patna, as you know. That's where the third council was celebrated. So here, this is India at the time of Moggaliputta Tissa, and this is the Indo-Greek kingdom. So when we are talking about the Indo-Greeks, which is a term that is just conventional, I don't think they call themselves, we are the Indo-Greeks. Surely they didn't speak English, so they didn't say we are the Indo-Greeks, but even the word Indo-Greek, I'm not so sure that they were, as you know, they were using other terms. But Sagala here is more or less at the border of this region, and this is the city, and here is Pataliputra. So that would be the kingdom, more or less the region where Indo-Greek culture was more or less expanding. Now, this is an example of the life of Moggaliputta Tissa, because so he had to be reborn. He was supposed to be this god that would be reborn, and the persons in charge to find the kid were two elders who apparently were not paying attention when the Sangha was meeting, and they were punished. So the elders say to them, friends, you did not give us your assistance in the settlement of this dispute, and let this be your punishment for it. The Brahma named Tissa will take birth in the family of the Brahmin Moggali. So they already know, as I was telling, this is like kind of the rebirth of a tulku, but it's not a tulku here, it's not a teacher, it's actually, it's a god that is going to become a teacher. The teacher has not yet been born, it's a god that will be reborn. The Arahants already know where, they know in which family, in this case it's a Brahmin family, and they request these two monks as a punishment. Remember, this is a punishment, actually that's a story, to go there. Let one of you take him away and admit him in the order. That means the first ordination. Let the other one teach him the word of the Buddha. So these two monks will have to be there. And then it says, and all of them remain till the end of their span of life. Right. So something here, there is a reference to this life. This is a bit strange. This is why I'm saying that maybe the life of Moggaliputta Tissa Thera is not completely historical, although we also find it in the Dipavamsa, which is more or less of the 4th, 5th century, like the commentaries. It's quite late. But the idea is that some of the Arahants of the second council, they survived until the third council, which is not, I guess, biologically, probably not impossible, very unlikely. And here when we see the dates, this Sigava attained Nibbana at the age of 96. So the dates don't really add up, but this story of Sigava and the name of Sigava and Chandavaji, it is known in the chronicles and in the commentaries. Now, this is an example of what I said before. And you can see that the passages that are highlighted in the same color are parallels. Sometimes the wording is similar. Actually, most of the time the wording is similar. and sometimes is identical, but clearly is the kind of the same model of the story. Now, I understand that not everyone knows Pali, but that's the first thing, that even if you don't know any Pali, I think it's quite easy to see that there is something similar in these passages. For instance, this one in red, Sadhu Sappurisa Manusaloke Nibbatittva Dasavalassa Sasanam Pagganhahi. And here it says Sadhu Sappurisa Manusaloke Nibbatittva Dasavalassa Sasanam Pagganhitum Patinyam Dehi. So there's a slight difference. And here's where when the Sangha is requesting the God, please, good man, having been reborn in the world of humans, Manusaloke Nibbatittva Dasavalassa Sasanam Pagganhahi. So hold up the sasana of the Buddha. The Buddha is the Dasabala, the one who has 10 powers, Dasabala, 10 powers. And similarly, that's the other sentence is the same. And the first one in green, it says, Mayam Marisa Sadevakam Lokam Anuvilokayamana Anyatrataya Milinda Saranyo Badam Binditwa Sasanam Paggahetum Samattam Anyam Kinchina Pasama, which basically means that the Arhants are telling the God that they have looked everywhere, but they couldn't find anyone who would be capable of discussing with King Milinda, having a debate, a philosophical debate with King Milinda. Similarly, in the life of Tissa, the Arhants of the Second Council, we have seen the whole world of humans, check out all the realms of existence, etc., and we haven't seen anyone who will be able to uphold the sasana. So in this case, it's just the sasana. There's obviously no reference to Milinda. So then the blue passage, you can see Evam Bhute Mahasino Devaputta. Then the God speaks. And in one case, the God is Mahasena, who will become Nagasena. In the other case, is Mahabrahma, who will become, is the Brahma Tissa, who will become Moggaliputta Tissa Thera. Yeah. Again, if we move on with the lives of these Theras, then in the case of Nagasena, there is one monk called Rohana, who is actually an Arhat. And because he's an Arhat, he was meditating so deeply at the time when the others were worried about Milinda. Rohana was in the Himalaya in his cave meditating. So he missed the meeting. That happens to all of us, especially nowadays that we are meeting on Zoom. So one forgets, oh, I forgot there was a meeting. So that happened to him, and he was also punished for not attending the visit to this should be the Tavatimsa, not the Tusita, I believe. So then he will be also given a punishment, and the punishment will be to find Nagasena in a Brahmin town, in the Brahmin village of Kajangala. So on both cases, they are both Nagasena and Tissa, even before they are born, they are already in the radar, in the radar of the Arhants. Some Arhants are already there with the mission to spot their house, and to visit that house for 7 years and 10 months. The 10 months is the period of pregnancy since the moment of the relinking from one life to the other. So the God takes a new life in the womb, in the embryo of the mother. So from that moment, there are 10 months in the Indian counting, plus 7 years, because it seems that they have to wait for 7 years until the child already got at least a basic education, I guess, and can become a samanera or a novice. So it's a parallel in both cases. The case of Nagasena, there's going to be Rohana, this monk Rohana, who will visit the house of Nagasena for 7 years. And all the time they disrespect him. They will never offer, so these Brahmins will never offer him any food. They will not even say good morning to him. They will not say anything, just ignore him. Or if they have to give something, they will just abuse him or give some insult, like, go away, you idiot, go away from here. This is the kind of treatment that he was getting. But he knew that that boy was destined for a great future. And the same goes with Sigaba and Tissa. So they have exactly the parallel stories. As you will see, it's the same text that tells the same story, the same episode. Then Nagasena learns the Vedic literature, and he becomes a master of Vedic literature at 7. But even at 7 years old, Nagasena realizes that this Vedic stuff is useless. So he checks the Veda and this is useless. Whereas Tissa, and again, this is a kind of discrepancy in the story, because we said that Sigaba was going there for 7 years. but Tissa becomes a Vedic master of the Veda and the other Vedic disciplines at 15. And instead of saying, so this is one of the differences. In the case of Tissa, he didn't reject his Vedic education, his Brahmanical education. He was actually very proud of that. Now, eventually Nagasena will meet Rohana, and because Nagasena was already not interested in the Veda, then he's kind of more open to learn the mantra. And that's the next thing, the next big thing. So on both cases, these kids, they are kids after all, whether they are 7 or 15. I mean, I'm sorry if you are 15. When I was 15, I thought that I was almost an adult. But let's say that a 15-year-old is a kind of kid, at least from this perspective. So Nagasena was kind of open and ready to learn a new mantra, but Tissa was reluctant. He thought that he knew the best mantra, and that's the term that is used. Of course, in Pali it's called manta, but it's the term. So Tissa thought that he had the best mantra of all. And again, we have parallel passages here. If you are interested in the slides, I can happily share them, and you can go into more detail later. I can also share some more materials, but you can, so these are the two different lives, theoretically different, but you can start reading Mahaseno Piko Devaputto Devaloka Chavitva Sonuttara Brahmanasa Variaya Kuchismim Patisantim Aggahesi. And in the life of Tissa, it's more or less the same. You just change the names, right? And instead of Mahasena is Tissa, Tisso Piko Mahabrahma. So instead of Devaputto is Mahabrahma. Brahma Lokato Chavitva, having fallen from the Brahma world, Moggali Brahmanasa Gehe Patisandim Aggahesi. So he got this rebirth in the house of the Brahmin Moggali. And so on. You can see more parallels here. Yeah. Here again, it is just another example. Because we don't have much time, I'm not going to stop. But it's just to say that I'm not kind of making it up. I don't want to cheat you. It is true that some of the passages are literally the same. So it seems that one is using from the other, or they both have a similar model, but or it's just by chance. I mean, just by chance they are exactly the same, but that would be very rare. Now, if we move on with the parallel lives, parallel stories, then Nagasena wants to learn the new mantra, and he asks permission to ordain to his parents. The Rohana cannot allow him cannot allow Nagasena to follow him because he's a 7-year-old. That's kind of not legal. So the parent permission needs to be obtained. And the same happens with Tissa, although as you will see, Tissa is convinced in a different way. First, he wasn't ready to accept the new mantra, but you will see that with an example from the story how he finally is convinced. So how Siggava, the monk Siggava, convinces him. Then Rohana will teach Nagasena the Abhidhamma first. So when Nagasena is accepted as a novice, he's still a novice, he's 7 years old, remember? So those of you who are like me, like I'm 40, and we find everything difficult, how to learn this, how to learn that. He was just 7 and he learned everything. He learned the Abhidhamma entirely. And that was the decision of Rohana. So Rohana decided to teach him the Abhidhamma because he was very bright. But he didn't teach him the Buddha Vachana, that is the Sutanta. He didn't teach him the whole Tipitaka. He started with the Abhidhamma. And this notion that the Abhidhamma is the portion for the smart people, that is already there. And that's why I was also saying at the beginning that these lives, they can represent the ideal Abhidhammika, the ideal kind of the intelligent person who will be able to understand this very difficult collection of text that is called the Abhidhamma. Well, in the case of Moggaliputta, he is not just an Abhidhammika in the sense that he learns that. He's actually one of the authors of the Abhidhamma Pitaka. In the case of Tissa, in the story, he doesn't learn the Abhidhamma first, but the story is similar in the sense that the teacher or the preceptor doesn't want to teach him the whole of the Buddha Vachana. And on both cases, these kids are prevented from accessing the entire Buddha Vachana. And that seems to be kind of pedagogical decision on the part of the preceptors, because I think they don't want them to attain a very advanced state too early, so something like that. So in the case of Tissa, he learns the 32 parts of the body, and he attains the stream entry. Nagasena will also attain stream entry eventually. Then they are both ordained in the Upasampada, the higher ordination that can only be done at 20. And there's that episode where Nagasena questions after that his preceptor, because he has this thought that learning the Abhidhamma before the rest is a kind of silly thing to do. It's kind of stupid. It's point. Why should one learn the Abhidhamma and forsake the rest of the Buddha Vachana? So the teacher, Rohana, can kind of read his mind, and he says, Nagasena, your thoughts are not very good. You are disrespecting your teacher, and so on. So he punishes him to go to Asavutta, which is the second. That's the teacher that is going to teach him the Buddha Vachana in one of these hermitages in the Himalaya. Similarly, Siggava will send Tissa to master the Buddha Vachana with Chandavaji. So in both cases, they first have a preceptor that teaches one part of the teaching, and then they are sent for a kind of second trial with the second teacher that is going to test them, and not just test their knowledge, but also test their patience. And you'll find this on both cases a story that is again parallel. It's the same, where the teacher ignores the student and checks whether the student will be patient enough with all the kind of strange and absurd reaction of the teacher. Very much what you see in some movies about martial arts or some spiritual seekers, like in the life of Milarepa in the Tibetan tradition, where the teacher behaves extremely cruelly. It's very cruel with the student, and one thinks that what's the point for the teacher to treat the student in this way? But the point is to test if they are real, if they are genuine, if they really want to learn or not. Because most of the time the students are very bright, they are very intelligent. So it's very dangerous when someone is intelligent, then that person may be too proud or too intelligent. They need to humble them a little bit. And that takes place on both cases. And again, this seems to respond to this model of the prodigy kid, the person who is very proud of his or her knowledge. They know that they are aware that they are very intelligent. So in this second stage of the training, they need to be humble. So here's one example. I think I still have, I'm not so sure if I have a little bit more than 1 hour, but I will try to wrap it up quickly. The elder finished his meal, and when the youth's childishness, so this is Siggava visiting Tissa. So the elder Siggava finished his meal, and when the youth's childishness had subsided, asked him, "How now, young man, do you know any mantra? And the youth replied, "Well, recluse, if I do not know the mantras, who else knows them?" And asked the elder, "Do you yourself know the mantra?" And then Siggava told Tissa, "Ask me, young man, you will find out." Thereupon the youth, that is Tissa, the young Tissa, questioned the elder Siggava on all those knotty points of the three Vedas, with their glossaries, ritual, phonology, etymology, and traditional lore as the fifth, whose meanings neither he nor his teacher could comprehend. As he had mastered the three Vedas even by nature and had now gained analytic insight, so the Siggava was an arahant and he had Patisambhida, so he could understand all the Vedas. So he had no problem in discussing with the Brahmin. Then the elder Siggava found no difficulty in solving those problems. First of all, he unraveled those problems and next told the youth, "Young man, I have been asked many questions by you. Now I too will ask you one question. Will you answer it for me?" And the young Tissa then says, "Yes, good recluse. Ask, I will answer." So you see how Tissa was very proud at the beginning, but now he's kind of overwhelmed. This monk has just answered all my questions. He knows more than I know about the Veda. He knows more than my teacher. So he has no other option. Now Siggava asks him a question. He says, "Yes, I will answer." Then the elder asked the following question from the Chitta Yamaka. And the Chitta Yamaka is one of the sections of the Abhidhamma, right? And the question is the following. This is a quote from the Abhidhamma, which is, as you will see, is kind of enigmatic. It's almost like a riddle. "He whose thought arises but does not cease, will his thought cease and not arise? Or he whose thought will cease and not arise, does his thought arise and not cease?" So this is interesting because this is actually a text from the Abhidhammika that we usually consider a philosophical work, kind of, whether you call it the psychology, philosophy, Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist analytical, ultimate reality, blah, blah, blah. But we never take the Abhidhamma as a kind of literary, more kind of poetic piece of art, as we do with Zen philosophy. It is very common in Zen Buddhism to take these kind of poems or paradoxes as texts that will kind of they will force us to think beyond words, so to say. In this case, I'm not so sure if that is an exact koan or something like this, but it is used as one in this case. And this is the mantra. So in this context, they are calling this kind of text mantras. These are not the mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum. This is not that kind of mantra. This is one bit from the Abhidhamma. So he whose thought arises but doesn't cease, will his thought cease and not arise? First question. Or he whose thought will cease and not arise, does his thought arise? So the young man, Tissa, who was not able to call to mind the beginning or the end, so he was completely confused, he asked him, what indeed, O recluse, is this? And the answer of Sigava, the Arahant, remember this is an Arahant that was part of the second council, so it's a very important person. He says, young man, young Tissa, this is called the Buddha mantra, the Buddha mantra. Very interesting. Now, let me see if the comment is for me. Okay. Yeah, so a little bit extra time. Yeah. Otherwise, I mean, there are the slides you can read further, but the main points that I have to make are already there. I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail because some of these texts are quite interesting. So this is the what I would call the horn riddle, a prahelika. As you know, or maybe you don't know, but the prahelika or pahelika in Pali is a kind of figure of speech, and it's basically something that we all practice, sometimes for fun, and sometimes it's done in academic environments, but it's kind of asking a very difficult question, a kind of enigmatic, it's a kind of enigma. It's a question that is difficult. So here, the Abhidhamma, the message of the Abhidhamma is presented in the form of a riddle. And I think that is significant. And this doesn't just happen in the life of Tissa. So this episode is slightly different in Tissa and Nagasena because Tissa has to be kind of humbled down first a little bit. Nagasena was ready for the mantra, but let's see what happens with Nagasena and his mantra. And I think with that, probably we can wrap it up and then have some discussion. So this is the boy Nagasena, and just to situate everyone, this is the Rohana and Nagasena, they meet, and Nagasena is very interested in this monk. You can imagine it's a young, actually a child Brahmin, and sees this monk with a different dress and so on. So they exchange a few words, and the boy says, it's a 7-year-old boy, do you know what the arts are, sir? Here, arts is the English word for shilpa, yeah, sitpani, or silpa, shilpa. The arts in the sense of the things that the subjects of school, right? What we learn at school or what the Brahmin will learn at his house. And the monk Rohana says, yes, boy, I know the arts. And that mantra that is the supreme in the world, that I also know. And the boy says, obviously, could you give it to me as well, sir? And so he wants the mantra directly, like a candy almost. And Rohana says, yes, boy, I could give it to you. And the boy says, then give it to me. And Rohana says, it's not the right moment, boy. Now I'm going to enter the house for alms. This is when the father of Nagasena has changed his mind about the monk and he's starting inviting him every day. So now Rohana, this monk who is the first preceptor of Nagasena, is invited. So he has arrived to that house for the meal. So first he has to sit. So Nagasena, the boy is getting impatient, but the monk is kind of taking his time. This is also kind of strategy to make the mantra attractive. Once Venerable Nagasena was ordained as a novice, so they asked permission and so on. I just jumped one part of the story. He said to Venerable Rohana, I have taken up your robes, Venerable. Now give me the mantra. Then Venerable Rohana thought, in what should I train Nagasena first? In the Vinaya, in the Suttanta, or in the Abhidhamma? So see that the question is, give me the mantra. And the teacher who has to give the mantra is thinking, which part of the mantra, so to say. So what am I going to tell him? What is the mantra going to be? And finally he decided, and he thought, this Nagasena is indeed a wise person. He will memorize the Abhidhamma easily. Thus he trained him in the Abhidhamma first. And once Venerable Nagasena was fully ordained as a monk, after that night of the ordination, so this is a few years later, he got up early, got dressed, and went for alms with a bowl and robes along with his preceptor, that is Rohana. As he was entering the village for alms, he was thinking. So the 20-year-old Nagasena now, we jump a few years, what a fool my preceptor is. What an idiot this preceptor of mine is. He has skipped all the Buddha's words, and he has trained me in the Abhidhamma first. Then Venerable Rohana, knowing Venerable Nagasena's mind, said, such reflections do not suit you at all, Nagasena. They are not fitting you at all, Nagasena. Then Venerable Nagasena thought, oh, how wonderful. Oh, how amazing. My preceptor could read my mind. My preceptor is certainly a wise person. I should beg him for forgiveness. So to make this long story short, it is quite interesting that finally the punishment, or what will be the culmination of the punishment, that means the disciplinary punishment for Nagasena, will be first to learn the Buddha Vachana at the Asoka Rama, none other than the Asoka Rama, with a teacher called Dhammarakkhita. And later on, basically part of his mission, in order to be released from the punishment, will be to go to the city of Sagala and have this debate with King Milinda, and so that King Milinda will recognize the truth in the Buddha's words. Then there are a couple more episodes that I can describe briefly, where people, like lay people who are Abhidhammikas, are described. So this would be the Abhidhamma is difficult, but it's certainly not something that is just for young, bright people. It's for everyone, according to the story. In the story of the Milindapañha, we find an old upasika, an old lady who has been serving Master Asagutta or Ashwagupta in the Himalayas for a long time. And eventually Nagasena so has to give her a Dhamma talk. And she requests a Dhamma talk that is deep because she is already old. So she wants a talk on the Abhidhamma. And Nagasena gives her a talk on the Abhidhamma. And on that same spot, both the old lady and Nagasena, they attained Sotapanna, or the first stage of the Noble Path, that is the stream entry. Similarly, there is another episode in the life of Nagasena that portrays what Abhidhamma could mean at that time, or the way it could have been presented in the literature. That seems to be that Abhidhamma was a kind of way of life, a way of understanding the teaching, perhaps concentrating on the ultimate truth. So in this case, it's in one of these punishments, then Nagasena has to travel from Sagala to Pataliputra, right? It's a long journey. Even today, imagine if you have to walk. So he was thinking, like, how on earth am I going to survive for all this long track? But lo and behold, he is lucky, and he finds a merchant who went to Takshila or some area in Gandhara, and is going back to his city, to Pataliputra. And he sees the monk, and after checking him, so they have a conversation. Eventually, he gets Nagasena into his wagon, and then the man says, so invites him for lunch, of course, and as this is conventional, after the lunch, the monk is supposed to offer some Dhamma talk. So the man says, do you, my dear, know what are called the Buddha's words? So do you know the Buddha Vachana? Dear. He calls it dear because the man is probably older and Nagasena is 20 something, just 20 probably. And Nagasena says, I, householder, know the Abhidhamma part. So at this stage, Nagasena just knows the Abhidhamma. And the merchant, this is the businessman from Pataliputra, says, it's a gain for me, my dear. It's well gotten for me, my dear. For I too, I'm an Abhidhamma man. So I'm also an Abhidhammika, my dear. And you are also an Abhidhamma man. Speak the part of the Abhidhamma, my dear. So this dialogue is quite interesting because it seems that it was possible at that time to be an Abhidhamma person. I don't know if today is also possible. I don't know how many of you are Abhidhamma people, I understand that the Abhidhamma is quite deep, and some people may get very serious about that, and then they say, well, I'm focusing on the Abhidhamma, but certainly this is something there. And that's why, again, I was saying at the beginning that these stories, these parallel stories, have to do with an ideal type of teacher, who is the ideal Abhidhammika. And on both cases, the ideal Abhidhammika is the teacher or the monk who will be able to debate, to have a debate. So even though today we understand that the Abhidhamma is a kind of discipline that is very philosophical, in the sense that you have to be very bright and read the books, there are many difficult concepts and all the rest. Actually, what it seems from these stories, if we read them in a more or less creative or with an open mind, it seems that when they are presenting the ideal type of the Abhidhamma teacher, this is the type of Nagasena or Tissa, is the person who is capable of engaging in a conversation with someone who thinks differently. And that person is capable of defending the teaching of the Buddha in a rational way, in a way that is not just a kind of combat, or what we see, this kind of verbal violence and abuse that is so common today on social network, but rather the dialogue of the pandits, the people who are learned, as hopefully we all can become, or you all are. So I think this kind of parishat, or this assembly in which we are today, is one of those events where we are interested in truth. We are not just interested in winning a debate. And by showing you these parallel lives, my aim was just that, to show you that if we read the literature, the Pali literature, sometimes we can learn a little bit more of what this literature is than what we will see in some manuals or books that will just say the Abhidhamma is philosophy, and that's all. So I think that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much, everyone, and I will be more than happy to answer questions and see if I can answer. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. Those of you who has questions, please raise your hand or unmute yourselves and speak. And also you can post it in the chat. Thank you. Sadhanath, please go ahead and ask your question.
Okay. So, Namo Buddhaya, Jai Bhim. I don't know if you know much about Dr. Ambedkar. Please let us know a little about whether you have heard of Dr. Ambedkar or not. And he's Buddha and his Dhamma. He has written the book. Now, so I have three basic questions. One is, could you please educate us about Rohingya problem in Myanmar? Has Buddhism moderated it in any way or influenced the problem somewhat? The second question is about, am I right in assuming that Theravada is oldest? Hinayana is more or less same as Theravada, and Mahayana seems to be the latest and seems to be heavily influenced by Brahmanical thoughts, placing Brahmans at the top and believing in people being born into various castes and stuff like that, and also prophecy about Buddha stating that 500 years from his time somebody would be born, and those kind of things, which seem to be humbug to me. Are you a Buddhist? If yes, can you please tell us about your journey to Buddhism? If you are not a Buddhist, can you please tell us why not? These are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Satinath. These are actually very, it would take a very long time to answer them. The first one was mentioning about Dr. Ambedkar. Of course, my discovery of Pali went actually side by side with the discovery of Ambedkar, because I studied in Pune. Actually, I went to Pune University to study Sanskrit. That's where I discovered Pali. And some of my friends were very much into the Buddhist community. I visited the Vihara in the university many times, and I read books by Dr. Ambedkar, and I enjoy them a lot. I think it's a person that is very little known still, even today. Although this kind of the history has been corrected to some extent, but at some point I was even tempted to try to go into maybe more modern history and try to write a biography of Dr. Ambedkar in Spanish. But because I was working on Pali, and so eventually I didn't do that. There's a friend of mine, at least an acquaintance of mine, I think he's going to write a book on Ambedkar in Spanish soon. In English, there are new books coming up. So I think when I came back from India to Spain in 2008 after my MA, I was talking about Ambedkar to everyone. And of course, like any historical person, like any great person, will have followers and detractors, but apart from that, I think it's a very fascinating writer, if nothing else. Like even for those who disagree, I think it's a very important person. Then the second question was about the Rohingya crisis, and unfortunately, I don't have an opinion here. I think it's very difficult to get. So of course, I mean, there is evidence, and I believe that the UN and other institutions, governmental agencies, and so on, they have data that is taken from satellite and so on. But it's a very complex situation. My understanding after reading the work of some experts in the region is that it's not a black and white situation, and unfortunately, violence has been part of the political life in Myanmar for many, many years, 2 years. And this, I can only say that this is just a terrible reality. And also that probably trying to point the finger to who is the culprit and who is not the culprit, who is the victim, that hasn't worked yet as a method to find peace. I can only say that, but of course, that doesn't mean that those who have committed genocide are innocent. So one thing is one thing, that's the other. And it's also very sad that a Buddhist country like Myanmar has to offer this image to the world. This, I think, is a fact. I know many people, many friends in Myanmar who have the same opinion, and we can only wish that this is going to change. Then regarding Theravada and the Hinayana, I think my limited understanding is that first thing, the Theravada does not represent the Hinayana, and the concept of Hinayana and Mahayana are very problematic. If you would discuss with expert scholars on the Mahayana, most of them, I believe, will agree that no one knows exactly what the Mahayana is, and therefore no one knows exactly what the Hinayana is. So Hinayana would be it's a concept that some Mahayana schools use to refer to the earlier stages of Buddhism. So it seems that the Theravada would belong to that, but some of the texts, the important texts in the Theravada tradition, are actually later than Nagarjuna, later than many Mahayana sutras. So it's not that in history Theravada comes first and then Mahayana. The Hinayana is a kind of stage in the system of the Mahayana, but Theravada is a tradition that is still alive. We may call it early Buddhism, that's fine, but that doesn't mean that it only existed 2,500 years ago. It's a 2,500 years history. So the Theravada has been existing, and other Hinayana schools, or considered Hinayana schools, they have disappeared already because there are no living traditions. And that's more or less what we know. I think there was also a question about my affiliation, whether I'm a Buddhist. I would say I'm a Buddhist, but that is a very long story. And yeah, my interest in Buddhism kind of grew in Pune when I discovered Pali, the Pali tradition and the Theravada tradition, and I had many classmates who were monks, bhikkhus, and I had the opportunity to discuss with them every day because we lived in the same hostel. I don't know if you've been to Pune, but there's the international hostel. So I used to live there for a couple of years. And when you spend time with someone, it's like you become like almost like family. And we had many discussions on Buddhism. So that was the origin, I guess.
If I may, can I ask you?
Sure.
Because the Hinayana, those who believe in that, they would not call it Hinayana because
right, exactly. It's a misnomer. Yeah.
The Hin means lower or something.
I think.
Lower.
Yeah, I think. I mean, sometimes we take it too seriously. I don't think, even though Hina it can be used in a derogatory sense, the actual meaning is small. Because it's the opposite of Mahat, right? So Mahat would mean great. It's like, you are great. Hey, my friend, you are great. But it can also mean big. And I think it all comes from that metaphor that you find in the Saddharma Pundarika Sutra, like in the Mahayana Sutras. It's a metaphor of actual cars. It's like you have a car, you have a small car or a big car. So you have to go on a long journey, like a bodhisattva, you better get a big car. But if you are going for the short journey and it's just for you, and you just want to become an arahant, it's a short journey, you get the small car. So I think originally no one wanted to offend anyone, but it is true that Hinayana is the term that the Mahayana uses, but the Theravada would never call itself the Hinayana. It's actually the Mahayana. So every yana will call itself the great, the good vehicle.
And finally, so you came to Pune as a tourist or something and became interested in
No. I went to Pune to learn Kavya. I was interested in poetry. I wanted to read Kalidasa and Bana and all the Indian poets, and to read the epics, Ramayana and so on. I was interested in Sanskrit at that time. So it just because in my syllabus I had to take 3 subjects. And one was a kind of optional. And in the optional, I could choose Prakrit or Sanskrit pedagogy or Pali. And then I chose Pali. And that's how I discovered Pali. And actually, my first Pali text that I read was the Milindapañha, precisely. And that's how I entered into. But I was not there just by chance. It's just that I was there to study Sanskrit, and I ended up interested in Pali.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
And thanks to the moderator who allowed me to ask the follow-up questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Sadhana. Thank you, Alex, for the answering Sadhana's question. And next we have Meshram family for their questions. Please unmute yourselves.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alexis. Grateful for your talk. Very interesting topic. I have a couple of questions. To finding the similarity that you identified is kind of very interesting, but I have seen in a lot of Tipitaka Kathas that are related to stories which happened within Buddha's life with different disciples are kind of similar in nature. How they go about telling the previous lives, or how they are gonna go about how things are happening with them. So that being the case, this is interesting. But do you anticipate that the story of Moggaliputta Tissa might have been preserved in oral tradition rather than getting added into the text, he being the preceptor or he being the convenor of the Third Buddhist Council? Obviously, he wouldn't have liked to have his story added into anywhere that he's going to get written, so that he doesn't really project himself as to be somebody who is very important or something like that. And that might have continued until some opportune time where people thought like, oh yeah, we need to kind of document these two things together as a part of Tika or Anutika. Just your thoughts, sir. Thank you. And thank you for taking this very interesting topic.
Thank you so much. So yeah, absolutely. I think it's possible. In fact, the first time I saw the parallelism, I thought, well, is it just similar or is it the same? And the thing is that in many cases, it's not just similar, it's actually the same. And that's what I couldn't find any other example. As you said very rightly, and I also imagine that, well, there is a kind of archetype that the child who is born, you know, someone who is reborn and is kind of destined to a great task in the world, and that was a god or someone else who is reborn, and at a very early age already shows these signs of being someone who is already knows stuff, knows things, and it's kind of demonstrating certain wonderful abilities. The only thing is that I couldn't find exact parallels like these two. So in these cases, I found so many exact parallels, including, for instance, there is one that you will not find anywhere else, because there is only the Kathāvatthu and the Milindapañha. These are the only two texts that are prophesied by the Buddha, at least in the Pali tradition. There is no other prophecy that says, well, maybe I don't know if there is a prophecy now about Buddhaghosa that 1,000 years after me, Buddhaghosa will come and will produce the Visuddhimagga or something like this. But this parallelism, it's very clear in the tradition that there are these two great events that are debates. This is the Kathavatthu and the Milindapañha. And also in the biographies, we see the parallels that actually they match exactly. The thing is, which one is first? And is it possible that Tissa's biography is actually earlier? And it's the other way around, that maybe Nagasena's biography was based on some materials that were already circulating on the life of Tissa. And I think that's perfectly, I mean, that is very possible. I would say that would make more sense to me. It's just that the materials that we have it is what it is, and the text where we find the written text, where we find the life of Tissa, is later than the written text with the life of Nagasena. But if you are interested, if you look at the Chinese version of the Milindapañha, the life of Nagasena is not the same as the one in Pali. So it is possible that it's the life of Nagasena is an addition. What is very difficult to think is that it's just by chance that they are exactly the same. So one seems to be the model of the other, and that I think I may be wrong, but I think there is some kind of intentional similarity here.
Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate it.
Go next.
Dr. Aleix, I would like to ask you a question. Really captivating talk, really engrossing talk. Sometimes it is said that the structure of the debate in the Kathāvatthu and the structure of the debate in the Milindapañha is very similar to in the Samanya Phalasutta of the Digha Nikaya. I'm not sure to what extent the statement rings true, but this is one thing to remember. And the second thing is that some of the topics, for example, the theory of anatta, no soul theory, they are both discussed in. It is discussed in both these texts. Entry of the layman as an arahant into the bhikkhu order. This topic is also discussed in both the texts. Are these things part of the reason why you posit that the origin story, that is, the parallel life, that is the life of Moggaliputta Tissa and the life of Bhikkhu Nāgasena have a common origin? Does this also, the structure of the debate and all these things, does this also contribute to your study of positing, in this theory? Some of the topics.
Good question. I think it's all kind of very complicated question. Regarding the similarity with other canonical texts like Kathavatthu, the structure of Kathavatthu, Milinda, and suttas like the Samanya-pala Sutta, I think the three of them are quite different. And the Kathavatthu is unlike any other thing. The Kathavatthu, in the tradition, it is conceived as something that is basically very similar to the Samanya-pala or to any kind of conversation between the Buddha and someone else. The Milindapañha also tries to present itself as something that is very similar to the Kathavatthu. But if the Kathavatthu, in reality, if that performance was like that, it's a different question. We don't know. We don't have the video, right? No one was there recording the video because there was no video. if you just read the Kathāvatthu without the commentary, it's not even clear whether that is a real debate or that is a kind of Abhidhammika work trying to compare different views. There's a lot of Abhidhammika in the Kathāvatthu that is underlying there, and some of the way some discussions are presented, as you say, the structure, it's not that different from other Abhidhammika texts. Then the terminology is very much this Paramattha terminology. So that's another problem. Sometimes when we discuss about the Kathāvatthu, they say, well, the most famous Vattu in the Kathāvatthu is probably the first one, which is about the anatta. And then if we think of anatta in the sutta style, then we say, well, it's about anatta, there is no atta, etc. But actually, that's not the question in the Kathāvatthu. The first question of the Kathāvatthu is not about anatta, because it seems that all the Buddhist schools, they accepted anatta. That was not an issue. If you go to the Kathāvatthu, or the point of controversy, that's the English translation, is whether the Puggala, whether what we call an individual, is something that can be known as an ultimate reality. You can see that the way we formulate the question is totally different. It's very technical. It's not like, is there atta or there is no atta? Oh, there is no atta with just 5 kinds. It's not like that. Puggala is a term that everyone accepts, whether you believe that Puggala is Paramattha or not Paramattha. So the Theravadins believe that there is Puggala. In fact, there are individuals. You exist, I exist, and everyone here exists. But what we call Puggala, that is a kind of conventional reality. It's real, it is true, but in a conventional way, not in the ultimate sense. So in that sense, we will say that this Puggala is not the Atman, the Atta. But some schools, a very important school of Buddhism that has already disappeared, or not, because I think many of the Buddhists in the world are actually crypto-Puggalavadins. So many Buddhists are actually Puggalavadins unknowingly. So it's the Puggalavadins who believe that the Puggala, but their belief is like this. This is formulated in the sense of the Puggala is something that is an ultimate reality. But they get in trouble in that question because they say that it cannot be known in the same way that other ultimate realities are known, and so on. So it's a very technical way of discussing that is certainly not found in the Samanyapala Sutta. And sometimes in the Milindapañha you find things like that. But the Milindapañha is actually sometimes closer to the Sutta style. It's kind of more for all audiences. And the Kathavatthu is very technical, very difficult sometimes. Without the commentary, we would be lost in many occasions. So the Kathavatthu, what I would say is it's actually very different from the Milindapañha, but it seems that in the tradition, there is a need to establish this parallelism. And that is done in different ways. One of them is creating these 2 parallel lives of Nagasena and Tissa.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aleix. Thank you.
Alex, and I next ask Mahendra to unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Jai Bhim, guys. Namo Buddhaya. Thank you, Dr. Aleix, for this intriguing topic, and I'm really impressed with the patience with which you are answering all these questions. Thank you. So there are archaeological evidences of Buddha's existence, and followed by that, Ashoka's religious revolt and support to Buddhism. And there are so many archaeological supporting evidences, Shilalekh, name it, and all the caves and scriptures written in Pali, Prakrit language. But we do not find any of those which will kind of support existence of Brahmanical ideology in the term of, or maybe documented in the form of a Sanskrit language. And that leads to a couple of scenarios that there's one claim which try to infer that Brahmanism as a religion and way of life did exist at the time of Buddha, and Buddha's thoughts or philosophy was a revolt against those existing ideas. That's one thought. And second thought is Brahmanism kind of evolved or made itself available much later, and it's a byproduct of Buddhist philosophy much later in the timeline. So what is your thought or findings over the period of time?
That's a very good question. First one, I'm not an archaeologist, but I'm growing more and more interest in archaeology, even though we have findings, but archaeology deals with such a long span of time that some of these findings, I don't know, it goes from pots in the 7th century for the Common Era to the Ashokan inscriptions, as you said, inscriptions in caves. So basically, your assessment, I think, reflects the consensus among historians and scholars, philologists as well. So as a philologist, I work on texts mainly. And of course, we have to be familiar with texts. The earliest texts are stone inscriptions, which are archaeological monuments. So even if you are a philologist, you still have to be aware of certain objects that are not, it's not a book, it's just a stone, right? It's a rock pillar and it's in a temple and so on, it's in a cave. Your question about Buddhism and Brahmanism is very complex, and I'm sure that you know the work of Johannes Bronkhorst, who has written this trilogy that more or less expands on your idea. And I think he has very good arguments. I've been interested in notions of kingship in Buddhism and Brahmanism, but that is a kind of side project. And you can see how in Brahmanical sources like the Mahabharata, which some people would say, well, the Mahabharata is a kind of Kshatriya, right? Because it's war and these are but the point is, who is writing that? It is like if you go to Hollywood and you watch a movie on the Second World War and say, wow, it's a movie about war. So this movie is by warriors, right? It reflects the warrior, but the guys who wrote the movie, who shot the movie, they are not warriors, they are artists, right? They are kind of people from the world of entertainment and culture and so on. So it seems that was the role of certain Brahmins, apparently, who compiled the Mahabharata, and they kind of insert some of the ideas like what we find in the Gita. But also there is this chapter on the Shanti Parvan that I was looking at some point. There is the reaction of Yudhishthira after the victory is a kind of very much a caricature of Ashoka. And we don't know the date of this text exactly, but as what you say, it kind of sounds familiar to me. At least, I think it's at least partly true, which is a lot to say, because if we know that it's partly true, that is great. It means we have some evidences. There is a kind of mockery of Yudhishthira because he regrets the genocide that he has committed. He has been killing his relatives. He's been killing everyone. So all the things that Krishna recommends to Arjuna in the Gita are the things that then Yudhishthira, the king who has conquered the world, he regrets actually. And what he says kind of resonates with Ashoka's ideology, the second Ashoka, right? The peaceful Ashoka who regrets the Kalinga massacre and so on. But then, of course, everyone in the family, in the royal family in the Mahabharata, they kind of go after Yudhishthira and they say, like, that's not the time to cry, now it's the time to celebrate, and so on and so forth. So the Buddhist ideology and Brahmanical ideology are quite different in many ways. But I think that there are also some points in common. It's just that from the Brahmanical ideology and from the Buddhist ideology, the ideal type of saint or arahant is more or less the same. And that's why in the Pali Tipitaka, which I believe is a very old text, we constantly find the expression, this famous compound, Samana Brahmana. So it's always about Samanas and Brahmanas. And even Samanas, it doesn't mean Buddhist. It means any ascetic or any Brahmin. So it's people who have a religious life. And the Buddha sometimes praises the life of the Brahmins of the past, who were not engrossed in books or just cheating people with rituals and so on. So the Buddha himself, he calls himself a Brahmin in many occasions in the text. And I don't think that is some kind of later addition or editor. I think it's a kind of, the word being a Brahmin could mean different things in different places, like being a Buddha could mean different things. Historically, though, as you said, Buddhism is documented, Buddhism and Jainism are documented before the classical Brahmanism is documented. So what that means, I'm not so sure, but the notion that Brahmanism, so that the classical Brahmanism and the Veda are exactly the same thing, I don't think that can be sustained. There is a connection, but it's difficult to sustain. So that's the only thing I can say. I don't know if that helps or not. It's probably too scholarly, and I'm not so sure if that helps, but that's what I can say. Thank you.
Right. Just to add to that, what I have been understanding is that you touch Shramana and Brahmana, but actually the scriptures mention it's not Brahman, it is Bhamana. Shramana and Brahmana. Bhamana is the word which is kind of describes more of an intellectual kind of community, and Shraman is the community which kind of supports and works to get the society functioning. That's how it was mentioned. But I think later on it was the Bhamana Samskriti got interpreted as a Brahman Samskriti, and that's what was kind of passed on to the early researchers. Let that be Western researchers. So I mean, obviously,
how do you? So how do you know that Brahmana is not Brahmana?
There is some argument around that. Okay, Ra as a word was discovered and introduced into any kind of a verbal conversation or any written scriptures much later than those periods when these Shila lakes were being written. And some even believe that Pali Prakrit got Sanskarit, that means improvised and purified, and that's why it is Sanskrit, because it is Sanskarit, and Sanskarit Pali Prakrit, which is getting called as Sanskrit. So that's how the second thought justifies the roots and the basis of Sanskrit in Pali Prakrit.
Yeah, this is difficult because the paradox in what you are saying, you are using Brahmanical terminology, for instance, in Buddhist. So the word Prakrit it's a Brahmanical word. The Buddhists would never say that they write in Prakrit. They would say they write in Magadhi, or you know what I mean? It's like it's kind of complex. If you are really going after the truth and not after something that will satisfy, I understand that there are communities. And, we are Buddhists, the others are Brahmins, so we are the enemies. And we always try to find the argument that will justify our opinion. Similarly, if you go to the Hindutva fold, they always see that the Brahmin is there eternally since the beginning of times. The point is how to prove that. And maybe in the case, I'm not saying that it's impossible, although I don't have any notice of that the word Brahmana, which probably antedates Brahmana in Pali, because the as you say, the conjunct bra is not natural in Pali or in Middle India, in this dialect.
Yes.
But then that doesn't mean that Brahmana doesn't mean Brahmana. So these are two different things. It does, because in Jaina texts, the Brahmins are called Brahmanas. Of course, it could be something else that later on was associated. But if you start looking at the essential terminology of Buddhism, is a terminology that is very close to the Aryan terminology in general. For instance, the Four Noble Truths are the Aryan truths. And so what is Aryan it's also a concept that is shared between many schools in India, whether it's Brahmanism or Buddhism. Also, the name of the founder of Buddhism is Gautama or Gautama. That has to do also with this, let's not call it Vedic culture, but this ancient culture that you also find in Brahmanical traditions. There are in the names you find many similarities, but also, as you said, there are many dissimilarities. So it's clearly there is a difference. So I recommend. I don't know if you've read Bronkhorst's books, but I'm sure you will enjoy them, because he gives a lot of He quotes a lot of texts from Brahmanical sources that are kind of explicit. So they are kind of saying what you are saying, but it's the Brahmins themselves are saying that. So I'm not denying your claims. It's just that philologically it's quite complicated, as far as I understand.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you please mention the names of these authors?
In the case of Johannes Bronkhorst, we are lucky because all his books are online in PDF. So
yeah, can you please write them in the chat box?
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
There's one called.
Yes, Alex. There's one more, Sun too, and then we also have a couple of questions in the chat. We'll go through Sun too, and then we'll go for the questions in the chat. And if anybody else has questions, please post in the chat because we are running out of time. And also, please shorten your questions so that others get enough time. We can save the time as well. Thank you. Sun too, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you, Dr. Alex. In the presentation, when the young Nagasena requested to his teacher to teach him the Dhamma, and the teacher said, "Oh, Nagasena is very wise. He should be able to memorize Abhidhamma easily." So it seems to me that in the old time, the way to learn is first to memorize it and then to explain. And that's what I see in some monastery where Samaritans are taught to memorize Abhidhamma first and then get the explanation. But that is not possible for lay people. You know, we don't have much time, or when we start learning at the older age. So I would like to hear about your comment on this method of learning.
Absolutely, yeah, you are totally right. The method is the pariyatti, the word pariyatti that we generally understand as studying or the study of text. Literally means the verb is pariyapunati. That means basically to completely acquire. So you can pariyapunati anything, like you can pariyapunati a house and animal and whatever you want. But the point is here, what we are acquiring or what the student is acquiring is knowledge. And this knowledge is in the form of a text. So that will mean memorizing the text first. This may sound difficult, but it was even more difficult to have a book at that time, or maybe more unreliable, both probably. So memorizing was the way things were done, and that's why the texts are also they are formulated in a way that they are good for memorization. Sometimes they are not so good for reading. For instance, if you take the Abhidhamma Pitaka and you try to read that, suppose you say, well, maybe I cannot memorize that, but every night before I go to sleep, I will read a few pages of the Abhidhamma. Probably there is no point in doing that. It's not like a book you can read. I mean, if you want to do it, you can do it, but that's not the idea. The idea is the Abhidhamma is something, especially the Abhidhamma, but probably the rest as well, something you have to learn with the teacher. It should involve recitation, question and answer. Lots of the Abhidhamma texts are actually, they kind of reflect a kind of dialogue between the teacher and the student, asking how many dharmas are like this, how many dharmas are like that, and then you have to keep giving the answers, making all the possible combinations. So it's not just text, it's not just memorizing something, it's memorizing and then being able to use it in a debate. So that takes many years of practice and study, and that's why that was generally the task of children who have nothing else to do. They go to school, that's what they learn. In today's time, like we have to learn so many other things. What do we do? So probably the best thing to do if we don't have much time is to take a book on the Abhidhamma. Like for instance, I'm going to mention Professor Y. Karunadasa's books on the Abhidhamma, Theravada Abhidhamma, for instance. It's just that name, Theravada, is really, really good. And that gives you the gist of what are the ideas. So it's a book, it's the equivalent of what today, the way we would use today to teach the Abhidhamma. It's not that it's different or it's a kind of summary. It's just today, the way we learn things is different than the past. So we can use books, and certainly, I mean, we are missing part of it. We are missing the system. It's always ideal if we can memorize. If you don't have much time in this life, what is recommended, and I'm going to preach a little bit now, but what would be recommended is to make good actions or make punya, so that in the next life we are reborn as monks and we have the whole time. We can start studying from an early age and then develop the understanding. But sometimes you can learn the text by heart and not understand it. Like the young Nagasena knew all the Abhidhamma, but it took him a few years until he actually began to understand. And the understanding only takes place in certain situations. It's not just pure knowledge. It has to do with events in your life or some experiences that will allow you to see what that text means in reality, in a real experience. Yeah. So yeah,
Thank
I
you
think we
very
don't have
much.
much time, so yeah.
Question from Kusala in the chat. It is Kusala Dhamma from SSBU. The question is, were both Theras similar in doctrinal authority, doctrinal clarification, and doctrinal development? Thank you.
I'm thinking, so I'm going to think about this question, whether the stories in the text say that they are equal. And basically they both were equal in the sense that they became arahants. But in the sense of doctrinal clarification, doctrinal authority, they have the same, but they don't have direct authority. They have indirect authority because they are simply clarifying the words of the Buddha. So the authority is always in the Buddha's words. They are simply trying to explain how these words make sense to people who don't understand them. And doctrinal clarification, I would say that Nagasena is better, if we have to just for our conversation, because the Kathāvatthu is very difficult to follow. It's very technical. Or let's say one was more technical, one was more for everyone. Anyone can read the Milindapañha, and very few people can read the Kathāvatthu. And doctrinal development should be equal, basically, because they were both at the same level. Yeah.
One more question from Sakina.
Thank you very much.
Would you say that Mahayana is heavily influenced by Brahmanism and possibly even Theravada too? Quite a bit influenced by Brahmins? Yeah.
It's a good question, but it's very difficult because we don't have much time. I think the interesting question, so the interesting way to address this question is then, let's see if by looking at the definition of the terms, we can understand the answer. Like, what do we mean by Brahmanism? What do we mean by Mahayana? What do we mean by Theravada? If we suppose I'm not an expert in Brahmanism or in Mahayana, I just know that these terms are very complex. I know something about Theravada, and there are many different ways to approach Theravada and to use the term Theravada. There's actually a book that I'm going to mention in the chat.
Last question, Dr. Sheetal, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
So yeah, just to finish the other one, what Theravada is, some approaches to Theravada are basically social or ethnographical. So they will say, well, Theravada is whatever people do in Theravada countries. And other approaches are more based on the literature. This is my approach. And what I would say, if I have to define the Theravada, I would say that the Theravada is a corpus, a collection of texts that contain the words of the Buddha and the commentaries that explain those texts. Whether people follow that or not, that is not of the concern of the Theravada. The Theravada is the kind of the prescription, the norm. So for me, there is no problem in using a normative, Theravada term, so to say. I don't have any problem with the normativity of the concept Theravada. But some people have a problem with that. They will say, well, that's the theory. But in reality, then you go to a Theravada country and they don't do this, they don't do that, they drink alcohol. So that's the real Theravada. For me, this is a wrong approach, but that's my understanding. And with Brahmanism and Mahayana, it would be very complicated. These are very vast traditions. So what is recommended always is to try to keep reading. If you are interested in these topics, read more and more with an open mind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aleix, and so grateful. And it's such a wonderful experience to listen to you on such a unique topic. So appreciate your sharing your knowledge, Dhamma knowledge with us. So my question is, and I'm sorry if I missed that, if you already mentioned it. So like in Bhante Nagasena's bio or the previous birth during Kassapa Buddhas, as is mentioned, is there any reference to Moggaliputta's previous birth in some previous Buddhas mentioned?
No, and that in that case there is no mention. So here that is only a story that we find in Nagasena. So there's no parallel for this one in the story in the previous Buddha. We don't find the parallel.
Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We would like to go for the vote of thanks.
I would like to thank the moderator very much for I really appreciate the way you conducted the meeting. Thank you.
Thank Kranti for starting the session, and also the kids' motivational stories, Pash Wangari and Kranti for monitoring the session. And I would like to thank you, Alex, for joining us today. And thank you for taking time and patiently answering all the questions. And this is such a unique topic today. And we know that it's a vast topic, but thank you for shortening and explaining it in a clear way. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and we will look forward for further sessions and